We have another very important guest joining us, our very own Dr. Ben Becker. He is the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Ben Becker, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we are having you on to talk about Trump's deportation plan. We have some figures that are being appointed that are quite terrifying and have really, really, really bad ideas for how to deal with immigrants, which is just basically this horrific mass deportation plan. And of course, none of that addresses any of the reasons for immigration, which is, sanctions regimes and constant imperialist wars and just destruction of economies. So I guess let's start with, before we get into that, can you lay out what should we expect under Trump? Who has he appointed and why should we be concerned?
Well, he's appointed some of the most hard right, ultra right, anti-immigrant figures you can possibly imagine. They're not unknown figures totally, like Holman, who will be the new border czar. He served previously under the first Trump administration, but actually has a long career, including under the Obama administration and even before that. This is a guy who, when you hear his speeches, he's swearing at immigrants. He's saying, pack your bags, look over your shoulder. He's saying things like, we don't have to separate families when we do deportations. We'll just deport the whole family. He's basically, his message during the campaign and all the campaign rallies, he's saying exactly what they're going to do, which is mass deportations. If you remember at the RNC this year, they actually printed out signs that said mass deportations now. So it's become a actual rallying call, similar to Build the Wall in 2016. This is sort of the newest iteration of it. But this one, of course, has an even more dramatic and immediate human impact. While a wall might take years to be built and might not ever be built in full, they can start going after undocumented immigrants right away. And basically what they're promising is day one, the mass deportations will begin. They're promising executive actions that will eliminate protected status, temporary protected status, TPS, for wide swaths of people. It could be up to 1 million people. They say they're going to do mass deportations for all undocumented. Some people say that. Others say they're going to go after just the criminals. But it's likely that Trump, for instance, would change what are kind of the priority enforcement. So Biden says go after serious criminals for deportation, whereas Trump will say anybody charged with a felony, or maybe anyone at all. And I think in all these, these differences do matter, but the main thing is that they're going to unleash ICE and the Department of Homeland Security to basically go to war with the immigrant community. And if you've ever seen sort of how these raids work, they basically go into a house and often they will say anybody who's there, whether or not they've ever faced any charge, they could be working at a hotel or a local deli, have no criminal record at all, could have a family they're providing for. If they're there and ICE can't identify them as someone who has the legal status, they'll be taken in as, quote, collateral, and will just be put in the van and sent home. So they're going to have a rapid escalation of detention centers. I think that it is going to happen. I don't think it was just a sort of a campaign rhetoric. I think they have every intention, and this appointment shows it, to start carrying out mass deportations on day one. It won't be the first time in U.S. history something like this has happened, but it'll be the first time in quite a while. So I think it's going to be very dramatic, and we shouldn't sort of bat our eyes at it or hope that if we don't pay attention, it won't happen. This is coming, and I think it's going to happen in a lot of workplaces in particular.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about this issue that you alluded to is how the Trump campaign has really turned this into a rallying cry, whether it was Build the Wall or mass deportations. It feels almost like a release valve. Americans are getting hit so hard with inflation. People are struggling to make it, living paycheck to paycheck and all this. And really, like, the proposition or the sort of thing that people are being told is, oh, if we get, immigrants out, like somehow things will be better. But it really feels like a way, because Trump is not really bringing forward any grand vision of building anything or building an economic program or anything like that. His main proposal is like, oh, we're going to get rid of some people, What do you have to say? Because you said this is not the first time this has happened. How do you feel about this being used as a sort of like economic red meat, or sort of to sort of speak to people who are struggling right now? And what is the history of this being used as a sort of like a scapegoat issue?
To go through the whole history, we need a lot of time because there is a long, long history of kind of xenophobic, nativistic scapegoating. Uh, all throughout, it's especially pronounced in periods of economic crisis where the ruling class essentially wants to deflect anger. You can see Trump doing it when he talks about crime. You know, there's enough undocumented immigrants. You can, if you want to go and you have a whole agency like you did last time to basically just find any undocumented immigrant who's committed a crime and then make that a sensational news story. And you do that every single day for years. You build a perception that undocumented immigrants are more prone to violent crime than other people, even though it's not true. But the data be damned, you can still create the perception. The same even when like people were complaining about rent being too high, and they said, "What are you going to do about the rent being too high?" A very bread and butter issue that lots of people in the working class care about as their number one issue, given the number of people who are spending 30 to 50% of their income on rent. Or people say they can't afford a house. He says, "Well, I'm going to pass a law to make it illegal for an undocumented immigrant to take out a mortgage." Now, the percentage of undocumented immigrants that are taking out mortgages um, is like so small. It's having no impact at all on home prices. I mean, the real enemy in that would be like BlackRock and these big hedge funds that are buying up whole towns. But Trump's not going to agitate against BlackRock. He's going to agitate against the undocumented families that have usually pooled their resources to buy one home, and and they're doing it to live in pretty difficult conditions often. So it is very classic scapegoating. There's a long history of it. In the 1930s, in the U.S. during the Great Depression, they had something called the repatriation program that was carried out under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and they sent upwards to over a million Mexicans back to Mexico. They said repatriating voluntarily, but often they were just picking up anybody who was speaking Spanish or looked Mexican, including many U.S. citizens, and sent them back. Of course, this created a big labor shortage, and then they had to initiate a guest worker program because someone's got to pick all the food. During this whole period, mind you, and this is kind of interesting, most people don't know about U.S. history, up until 1965, there was no numerical restriction whatsoever on the number of immigrants who could come from the Western Hemisphere into the United States. So a lot of these immigration restrictions, especially on Latin America, are fairly novel, dating back to the 1960s. It also coincided with the termination of these guest worker programs in 1964. So the fact is that the United States has really always had a dependence on migrant labor in one form or another, especially in agriculture, but now you can find it in construction, you can find it in the hotels, in childcare. You have whole sections of the economy that would potentially collapse if there was a full-scale deportation of like 12 million undocumented immigrants. And it would also cost hundreds of billions of dollars to carry out this many deportations. And ultimately, when you look through the history of it, it doesn't lead to higher wages, or rent doesn't come down. Unions don't go stronger. Quite the contrary. Actually, these sort of mass deportation and anti-immigrant hysterias, all they end up doing is really strengthening capital. They allow people to be divided, the workers to be divided against each other. It creates a sense of terror in many workplaces. So I think organized labor in particular, which used to be anti-immigrant, and then basically changed in the 1970s and 80s to realizing, look, immigrants are coming here no matter what. And so the question is, are we going to organize them alongside citizen workers to fight for basically a common wages, common benefits, a common standard, and basically refusing to be divided against each other. This was a historic turn that organized labor made, which I think is going to be very important in the coming phase, because ultimately we need voices like that coming out and saying it's impossible to basically get rid of all immigrants. So the question is, we're here, we're living together, we're in the same neighborhoods. Are we going to fight against our common enemy? Don't allow ourselves to be divided.
One last thing I'd love for you to touch on, Ben, because I think it's really important to always keep this at somewhat forefront when we talk about the issue of immigration is we can't forget why people come here. Yeah, everything you said is totally important about the economy and the fact that, these people, undocumented immigrants, actually do a lot of really important work for practically slave wages, which is horrific. It's not like they're taking jobs that anybody else will do, especially for almost no money. But that said, people are leaving desperate circumstances. Lots of times, not always, but a lot of times it's because of US policy. So I'm just curious if you could run through that real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. If you were to put out a graph, for instance, of the big migratory surges of the last 10 years, whether it be from Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Cuba, you would find the direct imprint of US foreign policy, intervention, sanctions, blockades, basically making lives miserable for people. And then, of course, people leave. And where are they going to go? They're going to often go to the country that has a higher wage, that has more money in it, where you can sort of find some way to scrape by. A lot of these countries, even the ones that haven't been the victims of direct military intervention, like Mexico itself, they've had so much economic devastation as a result of U.S. imposed neoliberal policies. So much value has been extracted from these countries and basically repatriated or sent back to, exported back to the United States. So in a way, you can think of the migrants chasing the value that has been stolen from their home economies back to the empire itself, where then they often send remittances back to their families to pay for them because they can't survive in their home countries. And it's so important to underscore this, Rania. I mean, immigration has always been highly politicized. For a long time, the only way you could even get refugee status is if you were a victim of communism. The idea of political persecution in general was actually fairly new. It was basically always been a politicized category. It was a way of really drawing people out of China and the Soviet Union and Cuba. Those are the only people who ever got sort of immediate refugee status. But if you were from another country that was attacked by the United States, or was a friend of the United States, you wouldn't ever get refugee status. So it's always been highly politicized. But look at Venezuela now. Look at Cuba now. I mean, these countries have been thoroughly blockaded. So of course, people are going to come and try to make a living. So how can Marco Rubio or Trump or any of these people, basically say they're going to build a wall, they're going to deport millions of people? They're actually creating the migratory crisis themselves, or the migratory waves themselves. Trump himself, very interesting. I found this right before coming on the show. One of his last acts before he went out in 2021, in January 2021, right around January 6th, he extended the temporary protective status for over 100,000 Venezuelans in the United States because they were, in his view, like a right-wing exile base that was supporting him. So he actually extended TPS to over 100,000 Venezuelans so that they could stay here longer. But then as the impact of the blockade had a bigger and bigger role and Venezuelans in general started to come, then it became, these Venezuelans, right? So there's contradictions everywhere. And the main way, if you want to basically try to slow down the global migratory wave, which is over a huge number of people across the world. It's not just the United States. It's Africa, it's the Middle East, it's Asia. People are leaving because of environmental crisis, economic crisis. You have to address the roots of migration. And basically, you can't do that under an imperialist framework where all the value of the world is being concentrated in a few Western countries. You have to allow these countries to develop freely, develop with sovereignty, allow them to have political processes that are liberatory. If people had hope in their home countries, a large number of them would prefer to stay in their home countries rather than come to the United States and be subjected to low wages, disrespect, being vilified and demonized on the news 24/7, living, having to look over your shoulder, living in the shadows. Nobody really wants that. People would prefer to have a dignified life in their homeland, but actually it's the U.S. empire that's preventing it.
So important to understand it that way. Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.